Julie. That, yeah, number 4 is the guest. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Was the battery good?
Yeah, I changed it this morning. Hi, how are you?
I do well. We are coming back. We are just getting here. Oh, the apples are lovely. Yes, what would you like? What do you want? Would you like a cafe?
Hey, how are you doing?
Would you like a bottle of water?
No, something. Black. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Are you just going to use the podium and the
I'll probably take the mic and I'll maybe walk around a little bit. So,
Okay.
Yeah,
So no television or anything?
no,
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And then I don't want the volume on that.
Yep, it's on.
It's on, so when I put it on, I'll start to speak over it, right?
Yeah.
I think we'll wait.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, good morning, folks. We'll get ready for adult enrichment in about 5 minutes. So if you could, there are plenty of seats. If you could sit toward the front, that would be helpful. Thank you. You want to get this on? Sure. Okay. All right, folks. It looks like cupcakes are competing with us a little bit this morning, but people will straggle in. But I want to go ahead and get started because this is a really great topic, and I want to briefly introduce our guest this morning, George Martin. Not to be mistaken from the Beatles orchestrator. Those of you of a certain age will get that joke. They didn't get it.
Good
They didn't
move on
get
that
it.
part.
All right.
You're showing your age.
I know. Paul is found in his letters. Some of you are probably familiar with the fact that contemporary scholarship shows that there are 7 letters of Paul that we can identify as being authentically written by Paul. They have the voice of Paul, and George is going to speak about this in great detail in just a minute. And then there are other Pauls in the New Testament who aren't Paul, but were attributed to Paul. And it's very confusing because a lot of the things that contemporary people have problems with come from the letters of Paul that Paul didn't actually write. For example, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and George is going to speak to that as well. But to introduce George this morning, George is a fellow interim pastor like I am, only he's done it in Episcopal churches, so don't hold that against him. But I want to share just a quick little blurb from the preface to his book, because it's a great illustration of what it's like to be a pastor, okay? He writes, one special memory of presenting this material, he's talking about this book, took place at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Edina, Minnesota. The lecture was advertised as Finding the St. Paul You Never Knew. One person who came was seriously disappointed. She thought, said George, I was some kind of expert on St. Paul, Minnesota, and I would reveal secret places to see and visit in our sister city that she did not know about. Needless to say, I needed a different title for this book. So with that in mind, I present to you George Martin.
Now, am I on?
I don't think so. He's got mic number 1. Is he on? There should be a flashing green light if you're on. It is?
It says it's on.
Okay.
What's wrong with it?
Don't know. Speak now right into it.
What?
Speak.
Okay, is it working? Is
Yes,
this working?
ma'am.
It's working.
It's working now. Yeah,
Okay.
good.
Well, it's delightful that Pastor Scott invited me to come, and I'm really pleased to do that. Let's use mine. It's better. Let's see, it's yours. Oh, much better.
Yep.
Okay. I was having trouble with the sound because I also wear hearing aids, so it's just part of getting old. And also, I'm really pleased to be here. I must tell you, I have never, ever seen a church that had in their mission statement the word intellectual. Ooh, I know. I'm really pleased to. Yeah. I've been around here since 1975 when I was called to St. Luke's near Lake Harriet as their rector, and also I've been in the Episcopal Church, and then I also served as a Lutheran pastor as an interim and all, and then in my retirement I became a biblical scholar. And I don't have the usual credentials, but I have the respect. Move my voice up? Okay, I'll speak it louder. Okay. I have the respect of a lot of scholars who I've contacted and become friends with. And so if I have a website called paulfound.org. Very simple, paulfound.org, and on there I have the reviews of a number of scholars, and I've been pleased to have their backing in my work, and I'm now a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, and I go to their annual meetings, and I'm also a member of Westar Institute, which his history was the Jesus Seminar. These are very serious scholars looking at the earliest days of the Christian movement. Most people don't even know what Paul's name means. I must admit, I went to seminary, over 50 years ago, and I never knew, nobody ever told me what Paul's name means. Does anybody here know what Paul's name means? Oh, welcome to the school. It means small in Latin. So we have a question. The only time we hear the name Saul is in the book of Acts. And then in chapter 13 of the book of Acts, there's this little slip up that says, also Saul who was called Paul. And so the rest of the time in Acts, he's called Paul, except when he tells that conversion story of Paul falling down and being blinded and everything else. So we have to ask, did a Saulus with the sigma change one little letter to a pi? And what does it mean that a man who in the history of the Hebrew world bore a great name from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul is tall, he's handsome, and then here's this man who has an experience of Jesus Messiah, and did he change his name? And there's a whole history of people changing their names when they have a religious experience. All right? So, my book is actually an argument with Acts and the pseudonymous letters. They're sometimes called the disputed letters. I think it's more accurate to say they're pseudonymous. They were written by somebody else in Paul's name, and we're talking about 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and we're talking about perhaps Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. Those are the ones. Those are the pseudonymous letters that Now, not all scholars agree. Some scholars will say that Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians were written by Paul. They have their arguments. I came across a man who wrote a Pauline autobiography named George Lyons, and he was looking at the biographical statements of Paul in Galatians and Philippians. And my question was, what about the other 7 letters? And that's what's charted my scholarship and my work on this topic. Now, do any of you have any arguments with Paul, things he wrote or said? Wait, you do? What's your argument?
Some of the things he says about women.
He's offensive to women, right? Okay. Anything else he said that sounds offensive to you? Well, I'll just take that. I'll just begin with the comments on women, because that's very important. Open if you have a Bible in the pew, and you do have it. Open to page. George, you need your glasses. It's 1 Corinthians 14:36. What did I do with my glasses? I put them somewhere. What to me? Oh, they lost my pair. Oh no, here they're way down here. So here it is, 1434. All right. I'm on page 176 of the New Testament. And it says, as in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they should be subordinate, as the law also said. If there anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. And there it is. You're shaking your head. How did that get in the Bible?
It's like when you open the door and it says open slowly. Obviously, there was a problem.
There was a problem. Yeah. You want to notice something? Notice what is just in front of that verse that I read. You notice the little parentheses? See, it says before the word as, there's a parentheses, and at the end, as reached, is a parentheses. Okay? All right. So, what did the editors of the New Revised Standard do? They have their doubts that this is a passage of Paul. Now, a lot of the theories are that this is an interpolation. An interpolation means that somebody copying one of Paul's letters came across this passage and wrote this into that passage at that point in their copy of the letter, which was maybe happening in 150, 250. You know, Paul was probably met Jesus within a year or two of his crucifixion. Paul Paul and Jesus about the same age. Paul, we got one date we can find for Paul in history, and that's in my chapter, Paul in Arabia, which is the second chapter of the book. And I'll just tell you, we can pinpoint that Paul was in Damascus either in late 36 or early 37 and all. And he had been in Damascus 3 years prior to that, and that's when he had his experience of Jesus Messiah as he records it in Galatians. So we can, working with this, we find a lot of questions. Why did he go to Arabia? How did he get into the kind of work he did? All these kinds of questions are circulating around. But at the same time, there's this business that did people later on write in his name and put things in there that he didn't say or stand up, or they believed later about it? Because exactly the words that you read there are almost exactly what you find in 1 Timothy. So there's a scholar who does brilliant work comparing what's in 1 Timothy and what's there, and says, well, maybe this later person said, hey, that's what Paul said. 1 Timothy is pseudonymous. Remember that. It's clearly not Paul. All right. So the NRSV people put it in parentheses. I have another argument. Did you get to this part of the chapter? Have you read chapter 9 yet? So Corinthians is built upon all the problems that were happening in the early church. They had problems with the Lord's Supper. They had a problem with a man marrying his sister. I forget which it is. It's in the first part of 1 Corinthians. I mean, they were having all these issues, and Paul writes he got some reports from Chloe's people. And then he had some letters from them as well, and he's responding. Thank goodness they had all these problems, because we have a wonderful amount of information about the earliest followers in 1 Corinthians. So, what is it? The answer, the brief answer, is that men wrote to Paul. The men in Corinth said, don't you agree with us that women should not speak in church and that women should ask questions of their husband at home? Now, that is so opposite what Paul had just said earlier in chapter 12 about women prophets in the church. Women were prophesying in the worship, and Paul knew it. So how can you come around 2 verses later and say that, with this thing, he's reporting that, their words. And the brilliant piece is, and I've written a journal article on this that's been recently published. It's in verse 36, okay? What's the first word in 1436? What's the first word there? Or. Now, in Greek, the word is eta. It's a one-letter word, like A is a one-letter word in our language. Okay? So eta is a discursive pronoun. And the proper translation of that word is what? Like, what were you guys thinking? Didn't you follow my argument about how worship should be orderly and inclusive of everybody? And you're now saying that women shouldn't be involved? And he screams out at them and says, what? So Paul puts in something like we can say something and not mean it. And we can say later, I didn't mean that. The dialogue is argumentative stuff. And Paul is a master of it. So I assure you, in other ways, did you know that Paul talks about Junia? You ever heard of Junia? It's in Romans. Junia and Andronicus, her husband, they were apostles in Christ before I was. And he's had a witness of the risen Jesus, Paul has. Okay? So he's putting her in a category ahead of him as one of the witnesses of the risen Lord. And of course, wouldn't you know it, by the time it got to Luther's Bible, Junia had become Junius, a man, rewriting the Bible. Okay. So, what is the essence of my work? Well, there are a couple of things. One is, you probably had a few pastors past in how long has this church been here? Because when was it started? 1814. 1914. Okay, 3 years after my dad was born. Right. Some of you been here 50 years? Some of you? Yeah, right. Okay. You have remembered pastors from your time. And you may have some pastors that you might choose not to remember, but they were in the list anyway. Okay? We always have that, all right? So, Paul is a remembered pastor by the time Acts is written. And Paul is a remembered pastor when whoever it was were writing 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. All right? Probably was a remembered pastor when the guy who wrote Colossians and Ephesians was written. All right, so that's what we have is remembered history and cultural history. I mean, different kinds of history. And somebody said, "You're writing history," and then all of a sudden I realized mine is a history. Mine's a history of Paul, but not a biography. We don't know when he was born. We don't know where he was born, and I'm no ignoring Acts at this point. Acts is a wonderful piece in its own right. It has its own special place in the life of the church, but it probably was not written until the beginning of the 1st century, and the 2nd century, I'm sorry. So that's and the arguments of the way Paul is pictured in Acts is so different the way we read him in his own 7 letters. And so that's a big piece of my story. The other piece of my story is so clearly Paul placed his life alongside the most marginal in his world, the least, the nobodies, or one place I call it the slumdogs of the world. We're calling that movie Slumdogs and all. That's where we find Paul. Paul experiences their poverty, their hunger, their thirst, their lack of clothing, and all. And also, I even have a chapter called "Paul Lost in the Crowd" to capture the idea of he was just looked like one of the ordinary working stiffs when he came into a place. Obviously he had a brain that was phenomenal because he'd been trained as a Pharisee. But as he said in Philippians, he gave that all up as just simply loss. Didn't matter to him. So he places his life along the least. And then the other sign of that, and I've been working on this too, is that where's the place of the slaves in this community? And I believe the slaves inside the worship were treated as equals. The only place in their life where they could have any dignity was in the midst of Jesus people. And so I had to learn a lot about slavery in that world and how awful it was and all. And then we have to realize, well, did Paul ever say anything against slavery? And he did not say anything against slavery as an institution. But in the letter Philemon, we only read it once every 3 years in the Common Lectionary. I realized I had never preached on Philemon. I think we read it as an epistle on that Sunday, and then there's the gospel reading that parallels it and all. And so it's 325 words in Greek. It's the shortest letter in the Bible there. And it's a story of Paul addressing Philemon to say, "I'm sending your slave Onesimus back to you. Receive him as a brother in Christ." The question that hangs over that story is, well, 2 questions. It seems he became a follower of Jesus and was baptized by Paul when Paul was in prison. So an unbaptized slave by the name of Onesimus was sent to Paul, and a person in prison needs food, clothing, bribes for the guards, news from home. So, presumably, we have evidence of these things happening in Philippians. So this unbaptized slave is sent to help Paul, and Paul ends up baptizing him and sends him back and says, receive him as a brother in Christ and receive him as you would receive me. And in my paper, I say, wait a minute. Does he get to break bread that day in the household of Philemon with the others? And what about the other slaves? Will they be breaking bread? Does Philemon, we don't know. Does Philemon cross over and become a totally different person because of what Paul asked? And that household is a totally different place because of what Paul asked. So these are the kinds of things I kept finding out in my work. I have a chapter called Paul the Mystic. And I realized all the spiritual experiences he talks about, and I mentioned he's seen Jesus Messiah. I always talk in my book about Jesus Messiah rather than Jesus Christ because the word Christ sounds like his last name when you send a letter to him, you know. But for him to say Jesus Messiah means he's really stepping into the messianic hopes of the Judean people. And by the way, Paul was never a Christian. He was always a Judean follower of Jesus. That's the ethnicity, Jewish ethnicity at that time, to be a Judean and all. And so the word Christian appears twice in Acts, once in 1st or 2nd Peter, and those are later documents to be sure and all. It takes a long time for Judaism and Christianity to part their ways. And so what Paul was really inviting people to do who were coming from other ethnicities is, well, come on in the door. But just know the Jewish story, the Jewish way we live, the Jewish way we have our libations. We don't do our libations like the Romans, pour it on the ground. No, we don't do that. We have our own rituals that matter to us. So that's part of the way I learned about Paul and his mystical background. There's a 400-year tradition of Kabbalah mysticism in Judaism, which continues to this day in Hasidic Judaism, which you may have heard of and all. And so Paul's in this mystical world, and he has a story in 2 Corinthians about going to the third heaven, and he heard words that cannot be spoken back. Ineffable words are called. It's a really fascinating part of Paul's life. So my book is, you don't have to read, if you get my book, you don't have to read it chapter by chapter. There's no order to the chapters. It's a kaleidoscope. Looking at Paul in context of slavery, context of women, that chapter is called Paul, an Unmanly Man. Paul would have been seen by elite Roman men as an unmanly man for the way he lived his life and all, and the way he worked, and his friends who were at the bottom of society. That's the way that world was. So, and then at the end of Paul's life, he wants to take a collection to Rome. He writes his worries about it in Romans, and also he's intent on going to Spain. In my last chapter, I wondered, did he ever go to Spain? And we don't know. Some say he did, some say he didn't. But I think I know why he wanted to go to Spain, because it was the most dastardly crimes against humanity at that time was done by Caesar Augustus when he conquered the 3 rebellious tribes in northern what do we call Portugal or Spain at that time, and that's the way. By the way, slaves were made through either theft or violence of war. And every year they needed to replace 500,000 slaves in the Roman Empire to keep that economy going. 1/3, at least, of the population were in slavery. So those are things that in my book you circle around, you get pictures of Paul, and you realize that you learn a lot about the culture and history in which Paul was engaged. So I'll just stop there and ask if you have any questions.
When did the Christian church abandon Judaism? Now, it seems like a strange question, but I was raised Catholic, and there's not a belief. I'm not saying anything about Christ. I'm saying the fact of respecting where they came from is essentially what I'm saying. When did Christianity stop respecting the Jewish people?
Well, it happened over time. For certainly, there's a book called Borderlines by Louis Boyarin, B-O-Y-A-R-I-N, who describes the 400-year time when all of a sudden there were Christians and there were Jews, and they were no longer, in dialogue with each other. We have a beginning with Marcion in about 160 of the Common Era, who believed that we didn't need the Old Testament, and so he was fighting for a Jesus without the background there. But pieces of that happened, but then there were other places where clearly, there was. If you're going to be a father, I think my book is relevant in the sense that given what's going on right now in the Middle East, okay, I want you to embrace the idea that we have a very Jewish Paul, okay, very sincere about the story of Abraham and Sarah, By the way, do you know what Sarah means? She had a name change. Did you know this? She went, when she was Sarai, to Sarah. A Sarai was a princess. A Sarah was a ruler. Isn't that cool? And then, so Abram gets his name changed to Abraham, father of all the nations. And Paul really believes that. He comes to terms with the fact that, the world was Gentiles and Jews, and he now sees Gentiles as us, belonging to our story. It's remarkable. So we have a terrible history, and we've not come to terms with the Jewish side of Paul or the Jewish side of Jesus either.
My neighbor is practicing Orthodox. He's very open in this sense. And he's one of my favorite people in the world. And I deplore the fact that Europe is just concentrated on dispatching the Jewish world.
Yeah, my chapter 6 is called Paul Sent to the Nations, and I deal with issues of Halakha, Haggadah, and all those things that are important in the Jewish world and how it would work. And by the way, Jews had to negotiate in that world like we all have to negotiate when you go into another part of the world how to manage. And so they were able to handle, Gentile friends, for the most part. It wasn't a serious divide as we've been led to believe. Any other questions?
Repeat your question.
I will repeat the question. Thank you.
I'd like to know how you come to terms with the scheme that he set up, the apocalyptic framework within which he's working, and the idea that he's presenting the Jews, the non-believing Jews, as stumblers, can't hear, eyes that can't see, disobedient, but all that will be solved in the end time when they become to be believers.
And are you reading in Romans?
I am reading in Romans. But it's very pertinent
Yeah.
to our time.
Yeah. So Romans has a couple things.
In my mind, the Jews are stuck because the end time didn't come, so they didn't become believers. So for 2,000 years, they're stuck.
Well, I'm not sure about you're saying about where the Jews stuck because they didn't follow Paul.
Well, I was saying according to his plan.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm just submitting my view.
Well, that's a very important comment I would make about Paul's sense of apocalyptic time. I have a chapter called Paul's Watch, only he wasn't wearing a watch. He was on watch. All right.
Summarize what she said so we know.
Yeah, she wanted to know about well, help me get this right. The divide of Paul's hope. Paul, do you see Paul condemning Jews in chapter 11, 12?
I do, but I do in a qualified sense because they are temporarily criticized, let's say. But his plan is that it's all going to work out at the end of
So where are what's the status of Judaism in Paul's eyes? Is that a fair question?
holding him. I mean, we talk about an including as being big on inclusion. But in my mind, there's a big if, there's a big qualifier.
You know, he sees, I guess you just have to say, he sees all Jews coming around to see who Jesus Messiah is. He comes to the conclusion, no, but not a problem for Paul. Right. I see, maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't help. What's really fascinating to me is how many Jewish scholars are interested in Paul. You know why? Because those are the only mainly the only documents they have written from a Jewish point of view in the first century. There's Josephus' history is also from that time, but it clearly they read these as Jewish letters, and part of the Jewish world is an argumentative world. By the way, they can handle dialogue and controversy. So.
Take on that is it's information about a sect of Judaism in that time. So it gives information about a sect of Jews or Jesus following Jews. Thus interesting.
Yeah, they were. But remember, all Jews were considered as barbarians by the Romans, and they were treated that way. So Jews were under the heavy oppression of Roman armies. So they didn't have freedom. Well, it's just that's where Paul places himself among all the other subjected people. That's my point. Yeah, right. Another question. Yeah.
You did us with the books here.
Yes.
How much are they?
Okay. My books are available for $30, $29.95 at Amazon.com, $10.95, $9.95 for Kindle books if you like Kindle and all. And I can sign the book if you want. Not pushing it, but I do have copies of my book, and I enjoy people who want to read it and get into it and all. And I'm also, by the way, I'm teaching OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota. Do we have any members of that?
I just joined. Nothing's happened yet.
Okay. Well,
That's my neighbor, my influential Jewish neighbor, and he said, "Oh, you can do it because it's wonderful for retirees."
I'm teaching in it, and I'm teaching my book. I have 2 more sessions. I'll finish up the first 7 chapters of my book, and I'm teaching the winter course. And I send a chapter a week to all the students from my file, so you don't have to buy the book. So if you sign up for my course in the winter course, you'll get the last 7 chapters.
It's $300. It's OLLI. You just approach them, and they will. If you send them the money, they will sign you up.
Yeah.
And you don't have to prove it.
So
I just did it. I don't even know what I'm looking for.
well, you'll enjoy the catalog when you get there. You'll have trouble picking, so many things to pick from. Yeah, it's great. I love teaching on this stuff. So, yeah. Any questions more about Paul?
Thank you, George.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Scott. Appreciate that.